Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Paladin Archives. You guys stuck with me through Morbius, so we rewarded you with Marceline. See? We take care of you guys. And, to prove that, I have another high-quality vampire waiting for you right here on our flagship series. Monster Menagerie! Yes, we're back with another vampire for this beautiful month. And a beautiful month requires a beautiful subject. And come on, before Edward and the gang were lighting up the cinemas and the libraries, Anne Rice's vampires were dropping jaws and biting necks. This month, we're taking an in-depth look at the 1994 vampire classic, Interview with the Vampire. And, more specifically, our vampire of the month is none other than the star, Louis de Pointe. Nailed it! I want to make something clear. Like all our vampires, when we choose a character, we single out a specific version of that character. When I did Dracula, I didn't consider the original novel or other interpretations of him, just the version the Bela Lugosi film depicted. Likewise, my information about Louis is coming only from the '94 movie, Interview with the Vampire, and not the books, or the sequel, Queen of the Damned, or the television series from 2022. If there's a discrepancy between Louis and the movie and these other sources, understand we're only going with the movie. Now, I had a heck of a time choosing which vampire to go with because this movie gives us 4 good options. Louis, of course, is the titular vampire that's being interviewed. He's the main character, so it makes sense to focus on him. But at the same time, Lestat is probably the most famous vampire from Anne Rice. It was even suggested to me that their, daughter? Claudia would be an interesting vampire to look at. And of course, we have Armand, who, well, he's Antonio Banderas, so why not? In the end, I decided Armand isn't in the film enough, Claudia is too weak to really focus on as a potential threat, and Lestat, despite being popular, isn't at his most recognizable in this movie. He gets way stronger in the later books and the follow-up movie Queen of the Damned. So, we're going with Louis. But, to make things more interesting, I will be referencing Lestat and Claudia as they become relevant. It worked with Domitresque and her daughters, so why not with Louis? So, before we get started, I just wanted to say that if you like what we do at the Paladin Archives, if you think the way we analyze is fun, and you want to know more about our world, please take a look at MatthiasTautimus.com. There, you will find author Matthias Tautimus' debut novel, The Paladin, which tells the story of a young man who is brought into our order, the Paladins, to find a way to save his dearest friend's soul from the clutches of hell itself. 1 part Dresden Files, 1 part SCP. It's fun, it's dark, it's maybe even a little scary. Read the first 3 chapters at MatthiasTautimus.com and even take a sneak peek at Book 2 with that book's Chapter 1. It doesn't spoil a thing for Book 1, and I think it gives a really good feel for the world of the Paladin. Okay, let's get this started. Lestat, Louis, show Edward how pretty vampires are supposed to act. I have to say, it was kind of fun looking at Louis. He's an old school vampire, the kind that feels familiar to me. Just check out his bio. Louis de Pointe was born in the mid-1700s in France, but spent the vast majority of his life in New Orleans. He owned a slave plantation, and after his wife and child died, he fell into a deep spiral of depression. He longed for death, but couldn't quite bring himself to actually, unalive himself. That's where vampire number 2 comes into our story. The vampire Lestat de Liancourt, or Lestat, found him in a drunken stupor and was, apparently, captivated by him. He did a little nibble, and suddenly Louis wanted to live. So Lestat, as he mentions over and over,
I'm going to give you the choice I never had.
Louis chooses to live as a vampire, and Lestat obliges. Now, I'm sure it was much more, obvious, let's say, in the books, but in the movie it's pretty heavily implied, and at times just shown, that their relationship was of the romantic persuasion. Obviously, a movie in the 90s had to be careful about what it could show. We'll come back to that sentiment at least one more time in this analysis. So, as said, the pair were a lovely couple, with Lestat as the teacher Louis would need to understand how to be a vampire. But though Louis could say goodbye to the son, he couldn't say goodbye to his humanity. He sustained himself on rats and dogs and other small animals rather than kill humans like Lestat. Lestat tried to get him to understand that humans were merely livestock and even got Louis to take some tastes from time to time. Still, in the end, he couldn't commit to the lifestyle, at least not then. One day, the pair stumbled upon a young girl, Claudia, who was infected with the plague and whose mother had died. While Louis tried to tend to her, Lestat danced with her mother's corpse. Yeah. In the end, knowing she was going to die anyway, Louis ended up biting and draining her. He felt miserable, thinking he had killed her, but little did he know, Lestat had rescued the girl, and then, right in front of them, gave her his blood, completing the vampire ritual and turning the young girl into one of them. An act we learn later is looked very poorly on by vampire culture. With that, the three became a family. If it can be said that Louis and Lestat took distinct parental roles, I suppose we could assign Louis the role of mother, as he was much more tender and gentle with Claudia than Lestat. Still, she was frozen in time now, unable to grow old. Lestat tried to treat her like a little girl for decades, giving her a doll one time when she literally had dozens, so many that the old ones were practically rotting. Realizing she'd never be a woman, never grow up, Claudia grew to resent Lestat and, with a reluctant Louis' help, killed him. Or tried to. Twice. They fled to Europe to find others like them and, eventually, succeeded by finding Armand. And also the Theater of Vampires or whatever. Those guys decided that Claudia and her new mother, that Louis reluctantly made, were abominations. So they executed them in a cruel sunlight well contraption while attempting to lock Louis in a crypt for presumably forever. Armand freed him, but not in time to rescue his daughter, so he lit the entire place on fire and did some vampire slaying that would make our stewardship paladins proud. Fast forward the years, and he adapts decade after decade until we reach the modern day. He's cold. He knows he'll never have his family back. He even visits a barely alive Lestat only to walk away from him. The years changed him, made him feel cold and distant, but that's more or less the point of the movie. Oh, also, it's very much insinuated that after decades of having Claudia as his daughter, they became lovers. So, there's that. Had no idea where to fit that in, but I didn't want to be the only one with that information. Louis is a complex individual. As stated before, he was devastated by the loss of his family and fell into a deep depression that was only abated when he was turned. But that was only a band-aid. Apparently, eternal life doesn't actually solve your problems, it just gives you more time to reflect on old mistakes and collect new ones. Overall, though, he's not a violent individual. In fact, for years he did everything in his power to avoid eating humans, relying on rats and other creatures to sustain himself.
All I need to find you, Louis, is follow the corpses of rats.
This is important because even in the scene in the present day, we see a flicker of that spirit in him as he spares the person that's interviewing him. This bodes well for interaction with the paladins. Either we'll be able to negotiate with him, or on the regretful side, it might cause him to hesitate in a confrontation. The movie really does give the impression that vampires in general have a disconnect from humanity. Many of them, like Lestat or Armand, view humans merely as a food source. They treat them like children when they're forced to interact with them, condescending and arrogant. Louis manages to avoid this to a certain extent, but seeing someone like Lestat, who is much older than Louis, gives a glimpse into Louis' potential future. To touch on them really quickly, Lestat, of course, sees humans only as a food source. There's some evidence that sexual desires might play a role, but the movie, despite the significant amount of nudity in it, didn't really explore that much. Lastly, Claudia, well, is just tragic. Since she was turned as a child, she never grew up. Decades passed, and she slowly realized she would never mature, never have the body of a grown woman. Her mind continued to mature, but her body remained forever a child. It seems like she realized she would never be able to take care of herself. When she feared that Louis would leave her for a more mature woman, she insisted that he turn a woman that would become her mother. She was scared, afraid of being alone. Yeah, this wasn't a happy movie. I don't think Anne Rice was particularly lauded for comedy. Okay, so I want to break this into two sections. Powers we see Louis directly display, and powers other vampires use that seem logical for Louis to possess. I do this because when I make recommendations to paladins in the field, it's better that I overestimate their abilities than underestimate. If I tell a paladin their target can fly when it can't, that's not nearly as big a deal as the reverse. So let's start with what we get from Louis. First, and I have to say most interestingly, he has, I guess you'd say, vampire eyes? Now, ostensibly, this means he can see better, farther, more detailed than a human, but what we actually see is Louis looking like he's high. So, apparently vampires see everything with brand new eyes. So they end up looking like toddlers staring at a screensaver. As Louis put it when he looked at a statue,
"The statue seemed to move, but didn't. The world had changed, yet stayed the same."
I imagine by the time we see him in the present, he's gotten sort of used to it, but even then, I think he still sees things with an awe that we can't imagine. Now, for Louis' speed and strength, we have a bit of an issue. The movie, and presumably the book it was based on, depicts certain non-vampire related things inaccurately. Sometimes, and this was common for movies from back then, certain things were taken for granted and assumed to be true without writers doing deep research. Please, don't think this is a knock against Anne Rice. I am not, nor will I ever be on her level of masterful writing. But, being that I have to take a Watsonian approach to analyzing these vampires, what I see depicted is what I have to work with. That disclaimer aside, I don't think Louis or any vampire in this movie has strength or speed enough to be a threat on the level of, say, Marceline, Domitresque, or, man, I hate to say this, Morbius. Ugh. Let's start with Louis' super strength. Well, let's say superior strength. I didn't see him or any of the other vampires breaking walls or tossing boulders. He was able to lift Lestat easily and pin him against a wall. Assuming Lestat is roughly the size of Tom Cruise, his actor in the movie, that's 150 pounds without trying. That's respectable, but not anything unbelievable. Sadly, we don't see any other real displays of his strength in the movie, so I'm gonna have to do something a little different. We're going to look at how strong he isn't. Near the climax of the film, Louis is captured by the theater of vampires and shoved into a coffin with metal latches to seal it. Try as I might, slowing the video down, zooming in, I can't tell if that coffin is supposed to be wood or metal, so I broke my own rule just a little and looked in the book. There, the coffin is, indeed, made of wood. For any average human, escaping this would be a difficult, if not impossible, task, but it's not outside the realm of believability to think that a human at peak strength could break free. Now, Louis is stored upright, though I believe upside down if I'm seeing the movie right. He doesn't have tons of dirt weighing down in the coffin lid, just the strength of the wood. Try as he might, Louis can't break free. Now, the wood is only about 2 inches thick, and it's not padlocked like it is in the book, just sealed with latches. If he truly had superhuman strength, he should have been able to break it. That makes me feel like he's more on the level of Edward Cullen. Maybe less. Man, Anne Rice's ghost is gonna haunt me after this. What about speed? Well, we see from him and Lestat that vampires are capable of pulling full-on Batmans and disappearing or reappearing where they want. According to Louis, it's the same way humans move, just faster than the human eye.
The same as you do. A series of simple gestures. Only I move too fast for you to see.
We only ever see it done in small bursts, which would be very dangerous in a fight with a paladin, don't get me wrong. But when Louis lights his second mansion on fire and leaves Lestat behind to burn, he and Claudia rush to get to their boat. Claudia calls out,
"The ship is sailing without us!"
And my first thought was that Louis would just pull a roadrunner and zip them both on board, but he just keeps running like a normal person. There might have been extenuating circumstances, but outside of impressing people, we don't see the vampires of this movie actually use their speed in a practical manner. Beyond those limited powers, we don't actually see Louis demonstrate any other actual abilities. Arguably, he could be using mesmerism on a few of his victims, but I think it's clear from the movie that he's just a very charming individual. So, let's look at the powers the other vampires display that it would be logical for Louis to have access to. Granted, in the movie Lestat says,
The dark gift is different for each of us.
but then immediately says,
But one thing is true of everyone. We grow stronger as we go along.
for me, that doesn't clarify whether Lestat's gifts were things Louis didn't have then or wouldn't ever have. Best to be prepared. First off is the ability to read minds. It's not elaborated on extensively, but Lestat is able to discern that a woman had her husband killed and blamed it on a slave just from a glance. It's unlikely she was thinking about that at the moment, so I'm inclined to believe that he has free reign over investigating a person's mind, rather than just what they're thinking of at the moment. Next is flight, or at least levitation. It's the first thing we really see from Lestat. While Louis is in a drunken stupor, Lestat feeds on him and hovers high into the air, up to the top of a ship's mast before dropping him into the water. Again, it's unclear if he can zoom around like Superman up there, but flight is definitely a possibility. We also see wall crawling on display from the vampires in this movie, and while Lestat shows it first, I choose to take a look at Santiago from the Theater of Vampires because his version is delightful, while Lestat's is horrifying. The aforementioned mesmerism is alluded to a couple of times, I think. Lestat tries to calm a dying girl that he just really wants Louis to eat. It certainly seems like he's trying to do a little Jedi mind trick when he tries to calm her, but the results are mixed at best. It could just as easily be that she's drunk, high, scared out of her mind, or some mixture of the three. But something similar happens at the Theater of Vampires when Armand and his clan sacrifice a girl live on stage. I'm not sure I have enough censor bars to get that scene onto YouTube, but I'll do my best to let you know what's going on. Armand recites the words, "no pain," and the girl, who was panicking and screaming just moments before, relaxes and gives herself to him. Lastly, I want to touch on the vampiric ability of instantaneous healing. Now, Louis doesn't really get hurt in any significant way throughout the film, but others do, most specifically Lestat. When Claudia goes into a rage after having to face the fact that she'll never be more than a doll to Lestat, an eternal child who can never have a woman's body, she slashes at his face twice. The wounds heal in just seconds. This seems to extend to even deeper wounds, as Lestat is soon after attacked by Claudia, has his throat slit, and is dumped in the swamp to be dined on by alligators. Apparently, just dining on that alligator that was supposed to end him was enough to grant him the strength to return back to the manor and seek his revenge. They got fangs. I know, that's getting less and less impressive since Morbius and Marceline, but I just needed to say it. Our pretty boys from Anne Rice have fangs, but that's hardly the most impressive thing about their bodies. Let's break them down a bit more. Unlike other vampires we've touched on, it seems like Louis and his kind need to feed daily. Apparently Lestat was known to feed on 3 people a night.
A fresh young girl. That was his favorite for the first of the evening.
It took me a while to understand this, but then I picked up on one of their weaknesses, addressed by Lestat himself: dead man's blood. It's quite similar in our Paladin work, but Anne Rice's vampires cannot drink the blood of the dead, even the very freshly dead. Lestat himself tells Claudia on her first feeding that she needs to stop before her victim's heart stops. By the way, this is also another potential example of Lestat's mesmerism. This explains why they have to kill so many people a night. Their victims die before they can drain all that blood. It appears that the source of the blood doesn't actually matter. Animals are perfectly fine to dine on, but Lestat seems to suggest that humans, especially evil ones, taste better. And when confronted by Claudia about drinking the blood of rats, Louis simply says,
I don't recommend them.
We learn that crucifixes have no effects on them. Stakes aren't instant kills, but sunlight is most certainly a definite killer. Sadly, this lesson is confirmed to us, the viewers, through the death of Claudia. Or should I say the execution? Man, this is a disturbing movie. We need to find something light for next month. Louis is many things. A tortured soul, a dreamer, a traveler. But his threat level is relatively low. Firstly, he regards humanity as something to be cherished, despite his nature. Lestat and him went rounds for at least a century over this topic, with the idea that Louis would rather dine on birds, rats, and even poodles than murder someone just being completely absurd to Lestat. When he lost real control for the first time and dined on his, house servant? Slave, okay? He was a slave owner. I don't have a nice way of putting that. Anyway, when he lost control and dined on her, a woman that seemed to genuinely care about him, he tried to end it all. He burned everything to the ground, and if not for Lestat, would have died in the burning manner. I think if Louis were to fall onto the Paladin's radar, there's a very good chance he'd negotiate, perhaps even surrender. That, of course, brings his threat level down considerably, but let's look at what happens if he, gets a little angry. His weaknesses are pretty standard. In fact, I'm pretty certain if I dispatched a paladin on Louis, I'd have to say very little besides vampire. Assuming his guilt and love for humans doesn't cause him to falter, even with his enhanced abilities, he's not a huge threat. Crucifixes don't hurt him, and he's actually capable of mobility during the day, so he's more dangerous than the threat level 1 I really should have given Dracula. Honestly, I think we're looking at threat level 2. A single parish should be more than capable of subduing or eliminating him. I would recommend full parish deployment, but I know most parish fathers would only send out a pair, maybe a trio to resolve this. I don't want to downplay Louis, but he might be our least deadly vampire. Please keep in mind the term least deadly vampire should be likened to something like least deadly gunshot wound or least deadly fall from a skyscraper. The Paladins are highly trained, highly disciplined agents meant specifically to answer threats like this. Louis could likely kill an entire village without much resistance should he have the desire. That in mind, like I said, he's actually probably likely to not only negotiate but possibly even surrender himself. But, assuming he's not in the mood to talk, Louis would be a pretty standard vampire containment mission. First, we have to keep an eye on him, see if we can find his lair. That means the responding parish will need to, stake him out? Huh? You thought you were safe from the vampire puns. Yeah, but seriously, don't worry about the stakes. Use his need to feed so frequently against him. Though, that same need to feed means we need to act quickly, as he might kill up to 3 people a night if he's not dining on rats. We saw with Lestat the dead man's blood will not only weaken him, but apparently cause his healing ability to fail as well. Lestat, who previously healed wounds in seconds, bled out a huge pool of blood when Claudia slit his throat after poisoning him with dead man's blood. That would take some setting up, so I wouldn't rely on it. Much more likely extreme trauma or perhaps forcing him into the sunlight. We see when he attacks the theater of vampires that beheading, burning, and, bisection. Santiago's shoulder was in that cut, so it's not technically a beheading. Either way, that's clearly an option. Actually, I can think of a specific parish quite talented in blade work. Beyond that, their best bet is probably to find his coffin and attack during the day. Unlike Dracula, Louis isn't a literal corpse during the day, so he can flee or fight back, but his options will be much more limited. Best option is probably to isolate during the day, then try to bleed him dry, outwork his healing ability. We didn't see how well guns work against Louis or his kind, but, well, there's a reason the unofficial motto of the Paladins is shoot it, then shoot it again. Assuming negotiation or surrender isn't an option, here's my official Paladin recommendation. Use sensing devices or abilities to track his dark energy, assuming he has it. Traditional tracking methods otherwise. Single Paladin parish dispatch with warnings to surrounding parishes for potential backup. Focus on finding his lair, cut off means of escape, and attack during the day. Focus on bleeding him dry. Blades and firearms recommended. Shotguns for larger wounds and higher blood loss. A single parish should be more than capable of dealing with Louis. And with that, another vampire is in the books. Now, please don't mistake Louis' low ranking on the danger scale as meaning he's less of a vampire. I refuse to live in a world where Morbius is considered a better vampire than Louis de Pointe de Lac. On that note though, we're over halfway through our vampires for the year. And if you want to weigh in on which vampire you think is best, the one that most defines what it means to be a vampire, make sure to stick with us. In November, we'll be putting out a poll, and in December, we'll be tallying the results and determining which vampire reigns supreme. Dracula, Edward Cullen, Lady Dimitrescu, Michael Morbius, Marceline the Vampire Queen, Louis de Pointe de Lac. Which one is your favorite so far? Let me know down in the comments, and while you're there, let me know who you want to see next. I really hope you've enjoyed Monster Menagerie. If you have, hit that like button. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss any vampire ranking excitement, and ring that bell. Hit us up on Twitter, check out my live streams on Twitch, and please swing by MatthiasTautimus.com to read the first few chapters of The Paladin and see some amazing artwork. Links down in the description. I have to say, I'm a little disappointed we didn't see more obvious displays of speed and strength that I could calculate. My analytical brain is getting a bit itchy for some calculations. Maybe next time. For now, I have to split. Maddie says Artifacts just got in a new painting and I have to see it. Until next time, keep your eyes peeled. You never know what's hiding out there.
Rats. When did you eat rats, Louis?
It was a long, long time ago, before you were born. And I don't recommend them.